Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. You'll presumably say something if you can't. So I'm going to talk to you today about accessible content. Just before we get started, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and my background. So I've got a master's degree in research from Lancaster University. I specialise in doing research with people with disabilities, and I've worked for a lot of the larger corporations, BBC, a lot of telecoms, Vodafone, and in the last 10 years, a lot of government. When I was at the Home Office, I created and ran a programme to train researchers in accessible research. And I've also been doing disability related training for adults since 2009, and I'm a mental health first aid trainer as well. Now, in terms of today, I thought I'd give you accessible content from a user research perspective, because you're all content writers and I can't tell you how to do your job. You know that better than me. And I understand from Rachel that one of the challenges you have is engaging stakeholders, getting them on board in terms of inclusion. So I'll share with you some of the tips and tricks that I use as well. And that includes some of the myth busters, so people tell you give you a particular line, how do you deal with that? And also some other ideas on how to create accessible content. So some of these you'll know, some of these you won't, but you can pick up on what you're interested in. And we'll have time at the end for all your questions. And just as a point, as we're going along, if you want to just type questions into Zoom, that's fine, or save them until the end, whatever you prefer. I'll do all the questions at the end. Okay, I was going to say I'll spend about half an hour on this, and then it'll give us 25 minutes or so for questions and things. So what does accessible content look like for user researchers? Well, I'll give you my perspective. So the first thing is about understanding your audience. So for me, that's normally something like personas, profiles, or you can use marketing audience. Sorry, marketing information. If you don't know who your audience is, it's very, very difficult to be able to design an inclusive approach. But you also need to understand how the general population fits into your audience, because you may not have everything in terms of your personas. So that's having an awareness, for us, what's the UK population like in, particularly in terms of disability. So to do that, we look at disability statistics and also include your audience in your research. So if you want to know what the experience is like for persona A, you don't go speaking to persona B. And quite often, particularly if it's hard to reach groups, I see people going off and doing research with other groups that aren't their target audience. So you're not always going to get, the right answers, particularly when it comes to inclusion. And I'd also try, and in terms of getting this across to your stakeholders, because we can go out, we can do great research, we can write great content, and then a stakeholder says, no, but I want it this way. So one way round is to try and personalize the access challenges for your stakeholders. And I'll give you some examples of how I do that. And another great approach for content is A/B testing, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So how do we know our audience? Well, you've got existing information, personas, profiles, marketing information. Every organization has something like that, because if you're going to sell something, you need to know who you're selling to. Looking at user research, so it might be a question of finding old user research reports or videos, and seeing what you can find out from that. one of the things I often use when I'm creating personas is job descriptions, because they tell you a lot about the person that organizations are looking for. But the other thing you can use is things like blogs. So if you're in a specialist domain, is there anybody out there that's writing about this and their experiences, and even little things, you know, from their life, because blogs do tend to be quite personal. So it's like, oh, I was writing this and the baby woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's like, okay, we've got a distraction element. It doesn't matter, this is a high profile job. So you're starting to humanize things. And also look at information in the public domain, minimum educational requirements perhaps for your role, and try and recruit based on that, that audience. The other thing that's really, really key, and I'd encourage you to get to know this as much as possible, is look at disability statistics for the UK, get to know them and share them at every opportunity. So I've included a few for here. What I would say, if you're looking more broadly, make sure you use credible sources rather than just, you know, some sort of random person's blog. So RNIB, so people who are blind or have a severe sight loss, more than 2 million people in the UK. RNID, 1 in 3 adults are deaf or hard of hearing, so that's 18 million adults have a hearing loss. Scope, 16 million disabled people in the UK, that's nearly 24% of the population. And the British Dyslexia Association, 10% of the population have dyslexia. And National Autistic Society, 1 in 100 people are autistic. So a few things to get you started there. Now, if anybody's good at maths, you might look at those figures and you might say, actually, they don't really add up. So Scope say 16 million people are disabled, but RNID say 18 million adults have hearing loss. So there's a few reasons for this. One is how these statistics are calculated and worked out, and some are actuals and some are approximations. Some are how people identify. So, for example, a lot of people who are hard of hearing and or deaf may not define themselves as having a disability. And then also a lot of people may have an access need but not actually know about it. So they've never had a diagnosis. And this is particularly true when we look at people who are neurodiverse. So that might be autistic, dyslexia, ADHD. Because it's only more recently, perhaps in the last, you know, even 10, 20 years, that more children are getting diagnosed in school. So it's very, very common that people don't know they have an access need, but they don't actually know. And that figure from the National Autistic Society, 1 in 100 people, that's pretty old. It's not been updated. But one of the things that's come out in the past 20 years as well, that a lot more women are autistic, but it manifests differently in women, because girls and women are better at masking. So these figures are probably all higher than they are. So I would say probably in reality in the UK, 25 to 30% of people have some kind of disability or access need. So persuading your stakeholders. Well, things to do from a research perspective is get them to attend research sessions. Seeing is believing. Do A/B testing so they can see the real comparisons. So that thing that they really, really wanted, and they said, you absolutely have to do this, and this is the best, and they see that nobody actually understands it. That's very powerful. Share facts and figures and research on readability and what makes things easier to read, and throw those disability statistics at them as well. As I said, introduce that personal element. So attending research sessions, well, what we do know is that seeing someone struggling with a feature or content is very powerful. And I've had this happen so many times that a stakeholder's been adamant that they want something and it's really important and they have to have it, and then they attend one research session and like, oh no, that wasn't a good idea, was it? Because we all tend to think from our own perspective and design for ourselves, and that's why we use personas. So if you can encourage them to come along, and if they don't come along, get some video clips in there so they can you know, at least see those key moments. So introducing a personal element. So what I tend to do when I'm doing training, and there's very much people have this us and them, you know, or disability and deafness, and it's, you know, other people. And I'll ask questions, which I'll also always say are optional, but I'll say something like, who doesn't know somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing? And I'll say, think of your elderly relatives. And I've never actually had a situation where anybody, and I'm going to say, raise your hand if you don't know anybody who's deaf or hard of hearing. I've never had anybody raise their hand, because everybody does. Because, for example, from the age of about 50 plus, 40% of people have some kind of hearing loss that often manifests itself with struggle with background noise. But by the time you get to 70% of people have hearing loss. So if you've got older parents or grandparents, you're going to know somebody. Who doesn't know somebody with mobility issues? So things like arthritis are very common, or bad backs. And if you're wondering how this links into, you know, how you're using the internet or content, then anything that restricts your mobility or results in pain or tiredness might make you just want to do things a little bit more quickly and spend a bit less time on things if you don't need to. And probably everyone can tick this box. So there's a lot of conditions and disabilities that result in pain and tiredness. So who hasn't had to work if they're sleep deprived or ill? So I should imagine anybody who's got a child or had a young child will always have had to work when they're sleep deprived, but also might be anybody who likes to go out for a drink or two or four on a Friday or Saturday night. So most people will have had that experience as well. And also, who doesn't know somebody with a reading disability? So this might be in schools. More children are getting diagnosed, so the likelihood is if you've got a child of school age, they will have somebody in the class, or it might just be somebody older, you know, who tends to avoid reading and writing, perhaps can't spell very well. Okay, A/B testing. So you're probably familiar with this, at least in concept. So it's just about comparing two different pages, and you can ask people to rate both. If we're looking at this from a user research perspective, the ideal is to rotate the order, because you can get order preference if everybody sees something first or everybody sees something last. But if you're doing this yourself, if you don't have user research support, I think it's just about starting doing it. And there are a lot of tools to do this automatically, but I would say, again, having that live conversation is really compelling. And then you might have video that you can share with stakeholders. Or these days, I mean, so much research goes on online on Zoom, so your stakeholders might just be able to join a call. And yeah, and you've got all that information to share. So what are our persuasive tactics? Okay, so again, trying to really hard reinforce that direct experience, get them to hear the voices of the users, whether it's live research, video clips or quotes. Do your analytics, and this doesn't really take a lot of time once you've got things set up. Again, have those statistics and throw them out there, and also personalizing that instance of disability. So let's look at a few mythbusters. So first one, our users are specialists and don't want simple language. I quite like this from Ben Aronovich. He never met a polysyllabic word he didn't like. I think it was talking about some kind of 19th century book on magic, but we all know authors like that, people like that. Probably anybody who, you know, particularly if you studied academically, you know, going back a bit, sort of 20, 30 years ago, all academic books were like that. It was like they'd all swallowed the dictionary. Now, this guy, Professor Trudeau, he's a professor of law and he's an expert on legal communications. He's done extensive research in technical legal language and communication. And what he found is the majority of people prefer plain English when they've given a choice. And even those with higher literacy skills prefer plain English. So even those specialists that you're talking about. And the reason is very simple. It's quicker and easier to read, because you might say, oh, well, we've got these really smart people and, you know, and they're very literate and they've got all these degrees and things. Yeah, and they're in busy jobs and they're really busy people. And if you give them something with loads of extra words in, it's still going to take them longer to read. So I'll share this PDF at the end. You can go and have a look at this research, but it's really beginning to show that if we make things simpler, it's easier for everyone. So we don't have any disabled users, so this is fairly common. So we've already looked at the statistics and we've seen that 24 to 25% of the UK population have a disability. So I think it's probably more like 30. In a few years, we might say it's more like 35. If you go and have a look at this report, Disabled People in Employment, House of Commons, so the employment rate for disabled people is 54.2%. Employment rate for non-disabled people is 82%. So still a lot of people in employment. So the bigger your organisation is, the more likely is you're going to have disabled people. You're not, that they're always going to be there. So some of them are going to be your audience or your workforce. And another key thing to remember is that disability increases with age. So we've already talked about hearing loss. Eyesight also can get poorer with age. And some key considerations are if we look at the obesity and diabetes epidemic. So with diabetes, you can lose your sight, you can go blind. People also can have limbs amputated, so they might end up being a wheelchair user. So the older your working population, the more likely you're going to have an increase in various different conditions. And also, I do believe that life expectancy has actually gone down because conditions like diabetes are increasing amongst younger people. So that's going to become more and more likely. And the other key factor is many people choose not to share information about disability, particularly invisible disability. And that is because there is still a lot of discrimination for people with certain disabilities in certain roles, because that gap, 54.2% employment rate for disabled people, 82% for non-disabled people, that's not necessarily anything to do with ability and capability. It's to do with bias on the part of people who are taking people on, thinking that people aren't as capable. So that's why people don't share information. Then once they're in role, they don't want people to know because they might be patronized, or people might think they're not capable of doing certain things. And if you want to go and read, well, start off reading Disabled People in Employment, but there's a lot of information about this, about all the barriers to work for people with disabilities. So that's why people aren't sharing. So they are there, but they don't necessarily want to share the information that they have a disability. So also, final myth buster, it's user researchers' job to ensure usability and accessibility. So yeah, just down to me. So many user research issues are caused by content. I remember there was a stat floating around saying 50% of user research issues are content, and I've seen a third as well. It probably depends a lot on what you're developing and what you're doing, but the language we use is going to cause a lot of issues, and it does. So it's really about working together and utilizing different skills. So content writers have different skills to user researchers. So it's about putting that all together. So I can do a research session and I know what's causing the problem, and I might be able to sort of sketch out, okay, so I need to replace this or that. But somebody whose main discipline is content writing is going to be able to come up with more ideas more quickly and look at that in different ways. So it's about putting everything together. And I would also say that everybody's responsible for accessibility and inclusion, because one of the problems we've had historically is there's always been that one person, that head of accessibility, that accessibility lead, but we all need to take control of that and be responsible. Because if you're in a working environment and you've got a colleague who's got an access need and they start talking to you, you're not going to say, oh, go and speak to the head of accessibility. You're going to need to have a conversation with them. So it's about bringing everybody in, so we all take that on board. So how to create accessible content. Okay, well, all the stuff we've already mentioned, so the setup, creating that research structure and making sure we bring in the stakeholders and get them on board and realize how important it is. But coming down to the nitty-gritty, one of the things is we need things to be structured and scannable. So what do we mean by this? Well, if you're creating a document, it means having clear headings that people can just look at that heading and know, oh, that paragraph is about this. And then if I look at all those little headings, I can see, oh, this is what the document is about, and give you a bit of an idea. Now, people always talk about this in terms of screen readers and screen reader users, because a screen reader can read out all the headings in a document, and you'll also be told to do what's called front loading the headings. So you put the important bit at the beginning so they can just do what's called audio skimming and read the beginning. But lots of other people benefit from that ability of being able to scan things. So for example, somebody with dyslexia who doesn't necessarily want to read loads and loads of stuff is like, well, can I scan this? Can I go in and just read the bits that are relevant to me, or read the first line, or etc. So by having a structure and making things scannable, you automatically make them easier to read. When I think of those long essays where you just see big chunks of text and it makes your heart sink. Shorter words and sentences, so it's just quicker. If you don't need that really long word, don't use it. And compound sentences, they can get very, very complicated. And what you find sometimes is people, particularly somebody with a reading disability, somebody say with dyslexia, they might take on board the second part of the sentence but not the first part of the sentence. So keep things shorter, and also lose the adverbs or the unnecessary words. This is very this and really that, and whatever else you're adding in. We're great at doing that in English. We like to decorate everything, but you don't need that. And also the complex words, if just because you've got a longer complex polysyllabic word, you don't need to use it. If you've got a shorter word you can use, then go for that. And the Plain English campaign, which I'll talk about later, they've actually got a glossary, and if you've got a complicated word you can look up and find a simpler word. And also direct language, so say what you mean. We're very good in English about dancing around and not quite saying what we mean. So I'll give you an example of that. So if I said to you, can you take the bins out? Well, what does that mean? It means, are you capable of taking the bins out? Will you take the bins out? Can you take them out next Tuesday? What does it mean? But you could just say, take the bins out, please. It's about being direct. And also peer review, because I think sometimes in a professional domain, a lot of focus is on you knowing everything, but ultimately we don't in this and so many other things. So if you've got a colleague you can ask, or as a professional group, if you've got somebody who belongs to the group, you can say, you can just have a read of this and see what you think and give me your feedback, then that's really helpful. And there's also a number of different tools that you can use that I'll talk about. And one thing that actually makes everything easier to use for everybody is just having a larger font. So there's lots of research on this. Just if you make it bigger, it's easier to read. Okay, so I would encourage you to look at the W3C guidelines. There's content particularly on writing for web accessibility. And the key thing to be aware of here is these are global standards. So lots of very smart people spending a long time working on this. So if you're struggling to convince your stakeholders about what you need to do, it's a good idea to be able to point to global standards. And I particularly point you towards the section that says keep content clear and concise. So what they're saying is avoid using unnecessarily complex words and phrases, even if the author wants to show off that they know lots of long words, etc. So go and have a look at all that. And also there's a number of different tools that you can use. So definitely have a look at Plain English. And they've got lots of resources and lots of free stuff, and they also do training in Plain English as well. I'm a big fan of the Hemingway app. I think it was actually some content writers that put me onto this a few years back at HMRC, but I find it really, really helpful. If you don't like the Hemingway app, there's loads of other different tools. So just have a look at apps for making your writing clearer, and see if there's anything that you particularly like. And I'd encourage you to share notes on this. So however many of there are you, it might be, oh, well, you know, so many of you go off and look at this, that and the other, and then you'll get through things a bit quicker and hopefully be able to, you know, come up with more options for your group. I'd also encourage you to do peer review. Now, as far as I remember, the average reading age in the UK is 9 years old. So basically, if you've got a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old, get them to read it. Does it make sense? And this is also something that I wrote about some of these ideas in this blog and covered some of the content issues. So have a look at that. And yeah, you'll get a bit more detail there.